I almost feel bad for JPMorgan that, like, how did you guys do this? Quote, widespread and long-standing failures, close quote. That is the term that the SEC used to describe what was happening at JPMorgan.
Welcome to Compliance Into the Weeds. In this episode, Matt and I take a very deep dive into the JPMorgan settlement with the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Commodities Future Trading Commission to the tune of $200 million for failures in record keeping. We look at not only the underlying facts, but many lessons learned for the compliance professional, benchmarking that you can use, and how you can improve your program going forward based upon the remediation of JPMorgan. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, the voice of compliance, back again with Matt Kelly, the coolest guy in compliance, for another episode of Compliance Into the Weeds. For our On the Naughty list, in honor of the week before Christmas, we have a juicy case for you today, and that's the JPMorgan enforcement action. Last week, JPMorgan was tagged for $200 million for essentially bad electronic record keeping. So, Matt, first of all, welcome and happy holidays.
Thank you, Tom. Happy holidays to you, too, and to all of our faithful listeners here. Thank you very much.
So, surprisingly, in both the Securities and Exchange Commission order and the Commodities Future Trading Commission, CFTC order, there were not a large paucity of facts, or was not a large amount of facts, but there were some pretty juicy FUBARs in here. So you want to just take us through how JPMorgan got in this position, Matt?
That's fair that there's not a huge number of facts, but Tom, I suspect if they turned over and included every single fact in their settlement order, it probably would have been 4 inches thick. Here's what happened. You may have heard it already, listeners, that as Tom mentioned, JPMorgan was fined $200 million, $125 million from the SEC, $75 million from the Commodities Futures Trading Commission for failing to collect and maintain employee communications when employees were basically communicating on their personal devices, on private apps, encrypted networks. They were using WhatsApp. They were using iMessage, I guess, on their iPhones. They were using various other non-sanctioned devices and applications to communicate about company business. We don't know exactly how many employees did this, but the SEC settlement order, which is really wincing reading if you want to go into it, man, I almost feel bad for JPMorgan that, like, how did you guys do this? Quote, widespread and long-standing failures, close quote. That is the term that the SEC used to describe what was happening at JPMorgan. This went on at least from January 2018 through November 2020. These unsanctioned communications and failure to collect and maintain their records. And this was done by apparently low-level employees. It was also done by senior-level employees who were supposed to be in charge of enforcing these records retention policies and these other employee communication policies that you don't talk about business on non-business applications or non-business devices. Or if you do, it must all be stored, and then it wasn't. Tom, it's a great big mess, and we have all sorts of specific examples I can give, but that's it at a high level. And Tom, the only other things I will note is that $200 million is the largest such fine ever imposed by the SEC and the CFTC together, the largest fine ever for an infraction of this type. And JPMorgan had to admit guilt in its settlement order with the SEC. So all of the time that we've heard so often from SEC settlement orders that a company neither confirms nor denies or admits or whatever any of the facts in the complaint, standard boilerplate stuff we have seen for years. The SEC has lately been saying they're going to knock that off and have companies admit the facts and their guilt more often. And now, right away, we see that here with this JPMorgan settlement.
So there were a few examples of some pretty delicious violations of this policy. And I want you to tell us about the supervisor who started the WhatsApp chat and just how ubiquitous this entire series of record-keeping violations was.
Well, we do have one executive director and supervisor of a trading app, yes, and he apparently launched a WhatsApp group in April 2019. He invited 19 other members of the trading desk to join in. That group then swapped at least 1,100 messages on this WhatsApp group through the rest of the year. And those messages included, they were discussing investment strategy, client meetings, analysis of market events. None of this was saved and preserved. It just existed off in their private WhatsApp group. But JPMorgan's records retention data servers and data storage devices and applications and whatnot, they had none of this. There was another executive director. He worked on the capital markets desk at JPMorgan and had texted with more than 100 coworkers, as well as apparently dozens of managing directors, heads of several business lines. He was chatting with JPMorgan customers, their clients, third-party advisors, others. There were at least 2,400 text messages this person had made from November 2019 through November 2020. And again, these messages existed apparently on their personal devices, but JPMorgan was not capturing them. And Tom, this is where we get to the really wincing part, is because JPMorgan didn't have these messages in its servers. When JPMorgan got a subpoena from the SEC saying, please turn over all records relevant to this matter, whatever the matter is, I don't know. But JPMorgan, they got a subpoena saying, please turn over all these messages. Well, JPMorgan turned over what it had, but it didn't turn over all this other stuff because they didn't have it, because the employees didn't save it on the company servers, on company messaging apps. So they missed all of this communication, told the SEC, well, we don't have it. Then the SEC found out through other banks it had subpoenaed, and they turned over these records. Well, here's all of these missing JPMorgan communications. So the SEC had to go back to JPMorgan and said, well, what is this? Oh, yeah, maybe we have some messages that exist, but we don't know where they are. Let's go look. So the SEC had to go back this second time to JPMorgan, basically say, please explain yourself, because we found all these other evidence through other companies under investigation. What's going on? Slow down the SEC investigations as JPMorgan went back to its employees, dug up all these messages that it didn't know that it had. And it was striking. There was one great quote from the assistant director of enforcement. As today's order reflects, JPMorgan's failures hindered several commission investigations and required staff to take additional steps that should not have been necessary. The settlement reflects the seriousness of these violations. Firms must share the mission of investor protection rather than inhibit it with incomplete record keeping. That is a direct quote from Sanjay Wadha, who is the SEC's Deputy Director of Enforcement. And Tom, you and I know, we have read plenty of these statements, like in the genteel world of SEC press statements and enforcement actions. This kind of language, you can almost see the steam coming out of the enforcement director's ears. Like they must have been so irritated that this happened. And I think that they are clearly trying to send a message to other banks. Knock this off right now. You know, if you have this going on at your bank, clean it up before we too come knocking on your door like we did to JPMorgan. That's my take on the SEC's statement that went along with this.
So, Matt, for me, the recitation of facts, the just horrible nature that the SEC had to tell JPMorgan this was going on, and they had to tell them more than once that this was going on, was obviously salacious and a lot of fun. But I actually saw a lot of lessons for the compliance professional based somewhat upon your recitation of the facts, but also about the remediation that JPMorgan agreed to engage with the compliance consultant. So could you walk us through some of the remedial steps that you saw Morgan was either in the process of taking or was going to do so through the auspices of the compliance consultant?
Yeah, that is interesting, I thought, Tom. So, as you said, JPMorgan has agreed that they will hire an independent compliance consultant to review their activities here with electronic record keeping and employee surveillance, and then come up with a report. And then the board at JPMorgan will look at this consultant's report. They will implement recommendations as necessary. But some of what this consultant has to look at, a review of JP Morgan's supervisory compliance and policies and procedures related to electronic communications, including those found on personal devices, a review of the training conducted by JP Morgan to ensure that people are complying with these policies and procedures, a look at the surveillance program that JP Morgan has to assure compliance. And for those not in the financial services world, yes, banks have to surveil employee communications quite closely to make sure that they are not engaging in insider trading or sharing other non-public material information in other ways. So employee surveillance is a big deal in financial services and in banking, and it is not at all unusual that they have a elaborate employee communication surveillance program. So that's another thing that the compliance consultant has to look at. And assessment of whatever measures JP Morgan uses to prevent unauthorized communications, a look at their their employee surveillance routines, and a look at the framework adopted by JP Morgan to address instances of non-compliance by JP Morgan employees. And that will include a survey of how JP Morgan determines which employees failed to comply with the policies and the corrective actions carried out. An evaluation of who violated policies and why, and what disciplinary requirements or actions were taken. So this is a pretty wide-ranging review of what JP Morgan has been doing here. And I do think that when you kind of read between the lines, there's an awful lot of talk about who was supposed to be enforcing this, why wasn't it enforced by these supervisory employees and managers, and then who decides to impose disciplinary policy or action on these employees but not others. What's the logic there? So there's, Tom, and I think there's a lot to discuss about the substance of what this compliance consultant is going to be doing. But Tom, I was also intrigued about, what this compliance person, this consultant, like what they actually are, because this sounds an awful lot like a compliance monitor to me, and we're just calling them a consultant. But Tom, you and I have talked before about recidivist corporate misconduct, and how are we going to handle this, and maybe more liberal use of monitors, which is something the Justice Department has talked about. This looks and feels to me like a liberal use of a compliance monitor, even though it's not the Justice Department. We're not calling them a monitor, but I mean, aren't they really monitoring? I mean, that seems, it certainly seems like they're a very close cousin to a monitor to me.
And that I really wanted to explore that point. But before we get to that, I want to hone in and go kind of inside baseball on some of these obligations that really intrigue me, because the last point in the order that the monitor is going to report on, the comprehensive framework to address instances of noncompliance. First of all, JP Morgan is to survey which employees fail to comply. And I was intrigued by the use of the word survey, because I don't know if that equals a root cause analysis, because later on they say how did the failure was allowed to occur. But then the last point in that same subsection was whether penalties were handed out consistently across business lines and seniority levels. That's not a phrase I recall seeing before, but I think it really speaks to what the SEC at wants to see is consistency. Consistency from the very top, or we would say from the boardroom to the shop floor. Really, any thoughts on why the SEC would specify that?
Well, I keep coming back to the point that there were apparently senior people in the first line business units at JPMorgan. People who were, they're not compliance officers per se, I don't know, but senior executives in the operating business units who nevertheless, it was part of their job to assure that these compliance policies were obeyed. And instead of assuring that the policies were obeyed, they too were violating these policies. And I think that when you see all of the talk from various voices at the SEC or the Justice Department or elsewhere about holding gatekeepers accountable, that's kind of what we mean here. Gatekeepers includes senior executives who are supposed to be setting the example for the junior executives that this is how we do things. And even if compliance is a drag, we do it because that's the way our business operates. And that's not what happened with this scandal at JPMorgan. They were chatting away on text and WhatsApp and their cell phones just like everybody else was. So I think that the SEC has a big problem with that. And I would even nitpick a bit about the language here, where whether penalties were handed out consistently across business lines and seniority levels. I mean, technically, I think it should be handed out inconsistently in that a more senior executive should be getting a more serious punishment because they're the ones who are supposed to know better. So if everybody is getting kid glove treatment, I don't think that's the consistency the SEC is looking for. I don't think that's what they mean. I think they want to see that senior executives who are supposed to be explaining and guiding the junior people are getting harsher penalties because they are engaging in these practices. At least if you're some 24-year-old manager trainee who's been on the job for 2 months and you're doing this, I can kind of see that maybe you're clueless. But if you are a supervisor of a trading desk and you are chatting away on a group with a dozen other senior supervisors, like, come on, guys, you know full well that is not kosher and you shouldn't be doing it and you should face some harsh penalties compared to the trainee. I think that's what the SEC wants to look for and find if did that really happen.
We're going to have a quick message from our sponsor, and we'll be right back with more on the JPMorgan $200 million settlement. So let me follow up on your thoughts around gatekeepers, because the primary or the first gatekeeper here was the compliance department's e-surveillance group, but they were not the frontline gatekeepers. As you pointed out, that was the supervisors, but the SEC order noted that the compliance department's e-surveillance group failed to implement a system of follow-up and review to determine that the supervisor's responsibility to supervise was being reasonably exercised so that the supervisors could prevent and detect employees' violations of these requirements. So that tells me the supervisors had frontline responsibility to not only prevent, but detect, but that the e-surveillance group did not have any follow-up review or probably oversight to determine the supervisors were properly fulfilling these obligations. And once again, I'm not sure I've seen that level of detail where the primary compliance function was to oversee a frontline business responsibility to supervise in an oversight manner. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I haven't seen it here in an SEC order, but I have seen this sort of dynamic from other banking regulators. So, Tom, I think it was last year, you and I might have even recorded podcasts about this, but last year, Citibank was fined by the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency and the Federal Reserve for wide-ranging risk management failures. It was not specific to employee communications on unauthorized devices. It was more generalized complaints about how Citi was handling itself. But the regulators there did really pick up on the idea that there were senior executives in the first line of defense at the bank, the operating units. They are in charge of overseeing risks in their units and trying to achieve compliance. At the same time, is a more central risk management function in the second line, and part of its job is to make sure that the first line knows what it's doing and is actually doing it, and therefore does that chief risk management function in the second line also have the ability to do its oversight of the first line. And Citibank got taken to task for all sorts of reasons in all sorts of ways. It's very similar to what we're describing here, that the first line has some responsibility to, like we often say, the business owns the risk. That is what this means, that these executives are in charge of making sure we're not using unauthorized devices and we're not dodging records keeping. The first line is in charge of doing that. The second line is in charge of making sure that's actually getting done in the first line. So the second line was deficient because it lacked the proper technology. It maybe didn't have enough clout. We could get into all sorts of ways that might go wrong. But it's this double-barreled approach to risk management and regulatory compliance. And so I guess you could have a misfire in each barrel. And that kind of looks like what we have here.
There's a couple of additional obligations in the SEC order I wanted to explore with you, and these are found in paragraphs 41 and 42. In paragraph 41, at 2 years from the date of the settlement, the compliance consultant is to report on discipline issued, including written warnings, loss of pay, bonus or incentive compensation, or termination of employment with respect to employees who have violated the policies and procedures. Any thoughts on why the government wants to see what discipline, if any, was imposed?
Well, I think that gets to whether you really are embracing a culture of compliance. And that is the catchword now from the Justice Department and from the SEC, that there is a new attitude on regulatory enforcement among these agencies, that they don't just want to see there is a specific issue that gets handled at one specific time in one specific way. They want to see that there's a real spirit of this is how we are trying to conduct ourselves. And the best way to demonstrate that is to hold people accountable. You, the company, hold them accountable. You do it by disciplinary action. Tom, I have to say, I'm actually more interested in the 2-year window there, because yet again, we're getting close to these 3-year terms of a compliance monitorship, and it sounds like this consultant here is really just a compliance monitor by another name. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but I keep coming back to the idea that we're going to see monitor-like people, either actual monitors or whatever this is here. We're going to see more and more of that in these regulatory settlements. And I don't know, it feels like a monitor to me.
I'm going to get to that. But before we get to that, I want to turn to paragraph 42, which is internal audit. And internal audit is to perform a full internal audit of the obligations for remediation that JPMorgan has agreed to, separate and apart from the compliance consultant. And they're to report to the audit committee of the board. And I have to assume that report will also be made available to the Securities and Exchange Commission. Any thoughts on why internal audit has been specifically mandated in this order to perform a job, and then how would they do it?
Well, I mean, I don't have any particular insight more than the language of the order there in paragraph 42, other than very clearly the SEC wants as much independent assurance as possible that JPMorgan is doing this, and JPMorgan has embraced a spirit of compliance and accountability and all the other buzzwords we might use. So one way to do that is the compliance consultant, but the other way is having an internal audit. I am sure JPMorgan does have a strong and complex internal audit function, and they are, in theory, going to be one step removed from the operating units, and they're going to be one step closer to the board and the audit committee, where they can just say, here are our results. So it's just more independent verification that what the SEC has been asking for here is actually going to get done. How are they going to do it? I don't know. I assume that they will go through whatever sort of standard audit you could use to assess compliance with electronic communications. I mean, there's various ways you could do that. I don't know all of the details about how JPMorgan runs this, but I have no doubt that a sophisticated internal audit function can do this. It's just the SEC is apparently giving everybody a kick in the rear that, guys, we want this done, so this is what you will do it. And that's that.
Okay, the monitor. Because I saw some very interesting language in this order that I really wanted to explore with you. And once again, the order names a position entitled Compliance Consultant. First of all, the Audit Committee of the Board of Directors has already retained a compliance consultant to address many of the issues described in the order, and that's actually specifically stated in the order. But the compliance consultant / monitor, and maybe we should just move to use the word monitor, it says, quote, may be the same consultant previously engaged by the Audit Committee. So we have at least one compliance consultant currently engaged by the Audit Committee. That person may or may not become the monitor. Then there's several of the obligations we've discussed. But then in the SEC order, there's a series of parameters for the relationship between the monitor and JPMorgan, including that if there's a dispute between JPMorgan and what the monitor suggests because of the onerous nature or some other reason, that JPMorgan's appeal is to the monitor, and the monitor's decision will be final. And so I absolutely agree with you that this doesn't sound suspiciously like a monitor. It sounds like it is a monitor to me. But the order itself really details the relationship, and the Securities and Exchange Commission is basically saying, we're not going to select the monitor. We do have the right of first refusal, or at least a right to refuse a monitor. But once that monitor's in place, that monitor is going to hold sway over what you do, JPMorgan. Really, what are your thoughts on the relationship between, once again, I'm going to use the monitor, although that's not used in the order, separate and apart from the currently in-positioned compliance consultant hired by the board?
I think this person is a monitor. I mean, come on. Like that's what this is. So, a couple of more details here is that this person cannot be fired without explicit express permission from the SEC. Clearly, they work for the Audit Committee. JPMorgan shall cooperate fully with the compliance consultant and shall provide the consultant with access to all such JPMorgan files, books, records, personnel as are reasonably requested. That's another bit of a clause there. Like, very clearly, number one, they don't trust JPMorgan is actually going to do this unless they have somebody peering over their shoulder. And number two, they are moving to insulate this person with as much independence and autonomy as possible. There's even a period for 2 years after the agreement terminates that the consultant can't actually work for JPMorgan in any other capacity. So there's another independence clause here. I mean, Tom, I think we could probably stack up the independence requirements of this person and line it up to the criteria for a compliance monitor from the Justice Department. I suspect there's going to be almost point-for-point overlap there. The only technical thing, I'm going to confess I don't know this, and I probably should. Like, does the SEC have permission to or legal authority to appoint a compliance monitor unto itself, or is that solely a Justice Department thing? Because maybe this is the way that we're going to get around that if that's the case. But I mean, come on, let's not kid ourselves. This person is there to monitor JPMorgan and assure that JPMorgan is living up to the terms of what the SEC wants. They are, for all intents and purposes, an agent of the commission, hanging around JPMorgan's offices, reporting into the Audit Committee. But I can't fathom a circumstance where the consultant is going to say, I want this, and the JPMorgan's going to say, no, take a hike. That's going to be a big deal. That's like, this is a monitorship and by some other name.
Well, Matt, having now thoroughly gone inside baseball for this order, I really believe even more so that there is, in spite of the pretty egregious facts and the lack of self-awareness and self-disclosure by JPMorgan, a lot for the non-financial institution compliance professional to learn from this, not only in terms of a gap analysis about how to think through the record keeping for electronic data in your program, but also as other topics as varied as determining either through survey or root cause analysis how failures occurred, discipline for failures that occur, if appropriate, and then consistency of discipline. And I think we may start to begin to see more DOJ or other agencies or departments' orders have this level of specificity.
I suspect that's true. And I would say, yes, if you're a financial services firm, like this is a warning shot, take it seriously because the SEC is not at all happy with how JPMorgan conducted itself here. But to your point, even for non-financial firms, if you're a compliance officer or a risk officer, you could be thinking about, well, what are my employees chatting about on their own personal devices? How do we know they're not doing insider trading? How do I know that they are not committing some sort of espionage or something like that? There are various points here that are worth considering about how you extend the cloak of compliance over this extended enterprise of personal devices, unauthorized apps. The technical measures to prevent it would probably be extensive and daunting. You're going to require a lot of human coaching and measures, a lot of training, a lot of talking about why it's important not to do this. But it's a cautionary tale. You don't want to be JPMorgan here. I understand that they have a lot of money. Still, $200 million for a fine like this is nothing to sneeze at. That they had to admit to the allegations, that's a thing. That's notable. And I do think it's another sign that the SEC's appetite for enforcement is ambitious. It's expanded from what we'd seen in the Trump administration. That is for sure.
Well, Matt, I'm not sure we could call this an early Christmas present for JPMorgan, but I'm certainly intrigued that they may have moved to the naughty list with this, so I don't know what Santa may be bringing them. I can't wait to see what post-Christmas brings us, Matt.
All right, Tom. Thank you very much.
This is Tom Fox. Thanks so much for listening to this episode of Compliance into the Weeds. Both Matt and I have written about the JPMorgan settlement, so we're going to link to both of our blog posts in the show notes. They reference the CFTC order and the SEC order, which I would encourage you to read for more information. As we wind down in 2021 and move towards 2022, if you've ever thought about starting a podcast, I hope you will consider that for the new year and that you would come on the Compliance Podcast Network. If you would like to do so, please give me a shout at tfox@tfoxlaw.com. Thanks so much for listening. We look forward to visiting with you next week.
This podcast is a part of the C-Suite Radio Network. For more top business podcasts, visit c-suiteradio.com.